This is a true story sent to me by one of my subscribers. He would like to remain anonymous for personal reasons. This is what he said. This story is about my uncle named Long and his son when they lived in Laos. My uncle had a terrible hunting accident that had traumatized him for life, and he blamed himself every day for what happened to his son. In 2018, when he was sick from old age and bedridden, he told us this story again, hoping to free himself from the long burden of guilt that had been lingering in his heart. I have heard of his story a few times from relatives, but it was not until the moment of his death that he told me his side of the story. It is very scary and sad, so I hope you all enjoy my Uncle Long's story. Before we start, I'd like to thank this person and all the people who have sent me their stories. Rest assured that I have received them. I know some of you have waited for a while, but I am trying my best to balance my YouTube time with my work and family schedule. Thank you for being patient with me. Hope you all enjoy this story. In 1965 in Laos, my Uncle Long married my beautiful aunt and had 3 adorable kids. His older child was 12 years old and the other 2 were under the age of 10. My Uncle Long loved to hunt, and every time he went, he always took his oldest child to accompany him. One day around the month of June, Long wanted to go on a 3-day hunting trip with his son because they were running out of food. He also wanted to get a few jungle fowls to sell to the locals. His whole family were very excited, and his youngest son made my uncle promise him to come back in one piece, while the second boy asked Long to capture a parrot for him as a pet, as all his friends had one. Long promised both of them and spent the evening enjoying their family time, not knowing that that was going to be the last time they spent time together as a family. On the night before the hunt, my aunt had a very odd and frightening dream. 5 minutes into her sleep, she dreamt that she was home alone, while my uncle and the 3 kids went to the store for food. My aunt was sitting by the door and she heard a ruckus going on, 3 houses by where she was. She threw the clothes that she was holding down on the ground and went to see what was causing the disturbance. When she arrived there, she could not believe her own eyes. One of the locals went on a hunting trip and killed a papa bear. Long's wife approached the hunter about the kill. The hunter told my aunt that there was a baby bear with the papa bear at the time when he was shot. He will be going back for the baby bear in a few days. The baby bear was smaller, so he shot the papa bear for more meat. Everyone was there and they all were praising the hunter. In this dream, Long's wife did not know who the hunter was but was thrilled, because a bear that size could feed their family for weeks. Her husband was going on a hunting trip tomorrow, and she could not wait to tell her husband about it when he came back from the market. She kept looking over her shoulder to their house to see if Long and the kids were home, when all of a sudden she heard a whining moan. It sounded like a person was crying from intense pain. She turned back to the crowd and she was in shock and disbelief. The hunter was not holding a bear anymore. It was her husband. Long was covering his stomach with one hand and the other hand covering his right leg. Blood was everywhere where he was laid down. The crowd was shouting in excitement, praising the hunter for getting a trophy kill and motivating him to go back for the baby bear. She was so shocked that no one stepped in to help her husband. Her heart skipped a beat because she could not believe her eyes. She stares with wide open eyes and cannot shut, like the whole world is breaking apart around her. She didn't even shake, in total paralysis without realizing what would happen after that. The sounds of the crowd's cheering were muffled as she was so shocked from seeing my Uncle Long, dead in front of her. Everything became blurry in the dream, but she rushed to my uncle and pushed the crowd away. With all the strength she had, she carried my uncle on her back and walked towards her house. The hunter who shot my uncle smirked at her and said, "If you really want that bear, you can have him. I will go for the baby bear. The meat should be more tender." My aunt carried my uncle to their house and opened the front door to an empty place with a brown, wooden coffin at the corner of their small living room. The coffin caught her by surprise and she woke up from her dreams. My aunt woke up from her dream and was so relieved to feel her husband sleeping by her side. She gave him an extra kiss that morning and noticed that it was around 5 in the morning. Roosters were crowing outside from their chicken coop. There were no clocks during this time, so roosters were their alarms. By the time roosters were up and crowing, it meant it was about 5 or 6 in the morning. She got up and woke Long and her kids up. Then she went to pack for Long's hunting trip. My aunt told him about her bad dream and wanted him to postpone the trip for another time, as a bad dream before a trip is a foreshadow that something terrible is going to occur. Being the skeptical person, my uncle told her that it was just a dream. Long has hunted his whole life, so he is a very confident person. I have hunted my entire life. I wouldn't let anything happen to me or our son, he said. His wife couldn't stop him from his trip, so she packed him food and walked them out. Long walked out with his son and entered the jungle of Laos. They walked 30 miles up the mountainous jungle and stopped by a stream to rest. They both ate and walked another 5 miles until they reached Long's favorite hunting spot. He scouted the mighty jungle for hours, but spotted nothing worth taking home. My uncle decided that he should get on higher grounds for a better vantage point, so he told his son to patrol downhill where there was a stream, because animals usually go there for a drink during the evening before their sleep. Long climbed up a mulberry tree and was able to see a whole variety of trees and bushes. My uncle was able to see the stream, but where his son was a big tree that blocked his view from seeing him. However, they weren't that far apart because he could faintly hear his son's coughs and sneezes. Long sat on one of the highest branches on this tree, making sure no animal could see or notice his smell. He sat on this tree and it was very relaxing, as the breeze whipped his long hair. It reminded him of when he was a child farming with his parents. It was the memory of my uncle as a kid, probably 5 years old, helping his parents farm. The blazing midday sun shone relentlessly on him and his parents as they were digging for potatoes with their rusty hoes. He looked up at the sun through the space between his fingers, wishing for gusts of wind to cool the day. "My son Long, come over here," said Long's dad. Under his dad's palm was a mole, wriggling trying to free itself from the tight grip. Being a 10-year-old kid, Long was ecstatic. He was full of excitement, jumping up and down asking his dad to let him keep the mole as a pet. Long's fond memories of his parents were interrupted by footsteps below him. There were leaves rustling and twigs snapping underneath him. From the sound of the leaves rustling, it had to be at least a deer or a wild hog. He carefully positioned his gun when he noticed that this animal was rather a very discreet one. It was not walking on 4 legs like an animal. It was walking upright, like a human. Upon closer inspection, it was a little girl. Long's heart started beating very fast. It felt like he was sitting on thin air because he was met by surprise. There was no way this girl could be out there alone in the middle of the jungle. Long stared at the little girl without blinking. The girl was no more than 3 feet tall with no shoes. Her hair was probably almost 3 feet long because it reached down to her knee. This kid was holding a tree branch over her head as she walked in the direction of his son. He was appalled but jumped down from where he was. Ignoring the pain from the jump, Long quickly stood up and was going to run to his son, but when he lifted his head, he saw his son, slowly walking towards him, with an inscrutable face that revealed no hint of thoughts and feelings. Was there anything out of the ordinary down the stream? Long asked his son. With his face still facing down, his son shook his head no and turned the other way, not wanting to reveal his face. Long knew something wasn't right, but his son did not look hurt, so he didn't mention the little girl. His child was just a kid. He did not want to spook him, so he instructed them both to head back to camp. As they both were leaving the area, Long spotted a deer by the tall primeval tree down the stream. The deer was right by the tree where his son was positioned earlier when he went up the tree. Long told his son to duck underneath as Long aimed his gun at the deer. Without hesitation, he shot the deer. It hopped a few feet and stumbled down, making a 360 spin down the stream. The deer crawled a few more feet when Long made another shot, executing it. Exhilarated about the kill, Long dropped his gun and was about to run down to the deer but was met by surprise. For whatever reason, his son had gotten up before him and ran from Long's side, down to the deer. The dead deer was about 30 yards from them. Long was so baffled by the action of his son because that was not a normal thing for him to do. He always waited for instruction from his dad when running up to a kill. Long looked at his son and was about to demand him to stop when he was met by surprise again. He thought his eyes were playing tricks with him. He was terrified. The person running down to the deer wasn't his son anymore. It was the little girl he saw earlier when he was on top of the tree. Her hair was flying everywhere as she dashed down the hill. What terrified Long even more was that the little girl ran down while screaming out, "I got him by the neck. He is ours now." My uncle looked at the deer that he had shot, and it wasn't a deer anymore. It was his kid, moaning in pain from gunshots. There was no way Long was going to let the girl beat him to his son. He took off racing down the hill, half jumping and half running, with a Hmong knife on his right hand, pleading with the ghost girl not to harm his son. Right before reaching him, the girl shifted left, disappearing back into the jungle. My uncle had shot his son and was tearing his eyes out, covering one hand on his stomach and the other hand on his leg. His son let out a long agonized sigh and said, "Dad, you shot me. It hurts my stomach so much. Please make the pain go away." Long told him to stop talking as blood came from his son's mouth. He ripped the sleeves of his shirt and pressed it on the wounds. Angry and infuriated at the ghost for blinding Long's eyes, he stood up and shouted at the ghost, "You evil ghost, you have your own path, and we have our own roads. How dare you cross path and take my son? You better run, because when I see you, I am going to cut you in half." Long picked up his son, grabbed his gun, and headed back to camp. He could not make it back home in one day because it was getting dark. He had no flashlight and the moon wasn't full, so there was literally no light for him to see. Long prayed to his ancestors to help his son. If his son survives, he'd sacrifice a bull for them. He arrived at camp and dropped his son by the campfire. All he could do was cry and apologize to his dead son's stiffened body. Although it was his son, they were alone out in the jungle. Deep down he was afraid of the body. Long pushed more woods into the fire, making sure it lasted the whole night. A little past midnight, Long fell asleep next to his son and had a dream of the kid. Long felt his son move and toss next to him. His son's wet and bloody hand grabbed Long's face. My uncle turned to his son to see that he was still alive. With the little strength that he had, he told my uncle his throat was too dry. Long reached for the bottle above his head. "I am so sorry for shooting you, son. You know it was an accident. I never meant to shoot you. Please accept my apologies." Long held his son tightly on his shoulder and blamed himself for everything. "You're holding me too tight, Dad. You are hurting me. I know it was an accident. Please take me home to see my mom," his son said, as blood dripped out from his mouth, muffling the words. All of a sudden, his son spat blood on Long's face and started laughing. My uncle was horrified and dropped his son from his shoulders. His kid started laughing at his dad. It was the same laughter voice from the girl earlier. Long woke up from the crowing of jungle fowls nearby. His first response was to check on his son. Unfortunately, his son was still unresponsive. He was not breathing and his face was turning blue. Long's son was still dead. He carried his son and continued home. Long had to take multiple breaks because he had not eaten for 2 days. There were many times where he thought of going home alone to get help, but they were deep in the jungle. He did not want to risk his deceased son's corpse getting eaten by wildlife. There were footprints of tigers and bears all around. He did not want to take the chance. Long could hear footsteps following behind him. Sometimes he would feel his son move and turn, but when he put his son down to check, he was always met with the blue face that was getting darker and darker. When Long was on the outskirts of the village, he heard giggles and footsteps behind him. It had to be the girl that made him shoot his son, he thought to himself. Long dropped his son and took a shot behind the path. As he was reloading, the giggles were heard again, irritating him even more. He took a few more shots. "You come near me and I will kill you," Long shouted as he picked up his son. Covered in old and new blood from his son, he carried him all the way to the entrance of the village, where he bumped into a neighbor of his. He asked his neighbor to get help as he stumbled from exhaustion. Long's wife was by the door sewing her kids' clothes, thinking of her husband and son. The thought of her husband coming home with an animal on his shoulder was on her mind the whole time they were out hunting. It would make her very happy thinking about it. His husband was an expert in hunting. He always gets kills from his hunt. This time it was different and she was not expecting the terror. As she was sewing clothes, thinking of her husband, she heard the same noises from the dream she had. It was almost like déjà vu. There was the same ruckus, only this time the noises were the cries and sobs of the villagers. A neighbor rushed to her house and called out Long's wife to hurry to the entrance of their village, because something bad had happened to her son. Upon seeing her husband and kid, before she could say a word, she dropped down to the ground and fainted from shock. When she woke up, there were 3 groups of people in her house. One group was fixing Hmong clothes meant for the dead onto her son, and the other group was around her, continuously massaging her to wake her up. She did not want to believe what was happening. She did not want to accept the truth, the sad truth that her son was dead. The third group was prepping for the funeral for her son that was going to be held for the night. Later that night during the funeral, Long's wife cried the whole time. Her 2 sons were by their brother's side trying to wake him up. Long could not look at his family. He was riddled with full guilt. It was around 3 in the morning and everyone was asleep, except for a small number of people. One that was still up was the person blowing the traditional Hmong instrument to send the spirit of the son off to his ancestors. Halfway into blowing the instrument, he saw something that made him cease the blow. At the dark corner of the deceased body was a small lit candle sitting on the son's chest. The guy was playing the instrument when he noticed there were 2 small hands reaching from under the body to wipe the son's face. The hands moved up and down the body and wiped the tears that were rolling from the eyes of the deceased. When the guy noticed all of this, he immediately froze and stopped the instrument, and that was when things went back to normal. He was terrified and woke up everybody in the house. They questioned him about what he saw, but he didn't admit to anything, as he was too scared. The entire funeral took 2 days and 2 nights. After the funeral, Long's wife finally explained to everyone that she had a dream of a hunter in the village killing a papa bear. Everyone was excited about the kill, but when she took a closer inspection, it was her husband. She pushed everyone to the side and helped her husband up. That was when the hunter laughed hysterically and told Long's wife that if she wanted the bear, she could take him. The hunter will go back for the baby bear instead. Her parents scolded her for not preventing her husband from leaving that day. Dreaming of bears is never a good sign. Dreaming of bears is always a sign of death within the family. If she was able to stop her husband from leaving, she would have prevented this whole tragedy. The next day, Long's wife went to visit his son at the cemetery. Her kid was buried next to where they farmed. When she reached the cemetery, she said the hair on her neck all stood up. She could feel that someone had just left her son's gravestone because there were fresh and distorted footsteps that she could not explain. She stayed there for half an hour when she heard something thrown at her behind the bushes. She was grieving her son and going crazy. She could not identify if she was hearing things or if things were really being thrown at her. But one thing for sure is that she could really feel someone watching her the whole time when she was there. She took off without saying bye to her son because she was afraid of letting whatever was there know. My aunt didn't want the ghosts to follow her home. When all of this was happening, Long was bedridden and could not get up. He was getting sicker as the days went by. He was too upset over the incident and blamed him for the death of his son. He also was too terrified of all the things he saw. The little girl to his son's dead body by the campfire, and the face of his son gasping for his final breath. A week passed by and my Uncle Long still could not get out of bed. He was bedridden and couldn't eat for days, and as a result, was not able to walk from the lack of strength. Worried for Long's health, his wife went to seek a shaman from another village to look into the incident. The shaman came later that day and examined the whole situation from Long's wife's dreams to the accident of their son. He burned incense and did a little ritual for my uncle. After he finished, the shaman told them both that Long's spirit had been tied by the little ghost girl. Long had a rope tightly secured around his leg, but luckily for Long, the shaman was able to negotiate his spirit with the sacrifice of a goat. Later that night, Long had a dream of his son. It was night time and he was sitting by the fire in his house. He heard a knock on the front door and it was his son. His son asked Long if he could enter the house and my uncle opened the door for him. In this dream, Long remembered clearly that his son had already been dead for weeks. However, that didn't stop Long from holding his son. Long started crying over his son again. His son wiped the tears off his dad and told him to stop blaming himself for his death. "It is not your fault, Dad. I was destined to live till that day. Please don't torment yourself over me and continue living your life for me. Thank you for being a loving father to us. If there is another lifetime, I will tell God to let me be your son again, but I cannot reincarnate knowing you're like this." His son could not stop the tears that were coming from his eyes as he said those words. Long burst out crying and woke up with tears rolling down his cheeks. When he woke up, he realized that he was in bed and not by the fire. The moment he realized it was a dream, he felt a slight movement at the edge of the bed, like someone just stood up from there. Long turned on his flashlight, and no one was there except for his wife sleeping next to him. That was the end of Long seeing his son. Long still blamed himself for the death of his son. The locals who hunt around the area where Long's son died reported it to be haunted. A few hunters mentioned that they had heard of the sons moaning in pain in the area. Some have mentioned that they have seen a dark figure there, following behind a little dark figure, assumed to be the girl that my uncle saw. One hunter went hunting around the area where Long's son died. He knew the spot where Long's son was shot, so he avoided it by going the other direction. However, he said that around midnight when he was sleeping, he heard the son crying and moaning, not wanting to die from over the hills. Later that night, the hunter dreamt of Long's son. The son was poorly dressed and hungry. He was starving because the food that the ghost girl brought him was raw, so he could not swallow it. Long's son hadn't eaten for so long that he did not have the strength anymore. The next day before leaving the area, the hunter left food on top of a log and told the son to eat the food. He said it was very terrifying because he was so scared of encountering the son and the girl. Long and his uncle had to go back to the place of the accident and bring food for the boy. They also burnt money and told him to leave the place. I hope you all enjoy my Uncle Long's story. His two kids grew up loving my uncle until his very last moment. In his heart, there was always a hole that changed him. He was still in guilt all these years. I really hope you are in a better place now, Uncle. Hopefully you are with your son up there. We will meet again. We all miss and love you very much. As I mentioned in one of my videos, the death of a loved one and the grief that follows is one of the hardest experiences we as human beings can go through. How you deal with grief may be different than another person who is also grieving, but please seek help. You do not have to go through it alone. There are people who love and care deeply about your well-being. Deepest condolences for your loss. Wishing you comfort, peace, and strength. May Uncle Long rest in peace.